with you all. We are preaching through a series of words that are important to Christianity in this Easter season, and this is the second in that series. And the word we're going to focus on today is mercy. And mercy is really a word that is deeply embedded within our Christian consciousness. In more traditional services that are even more traditional than ours, it is often the case that there is a confession of faith. And if we would follow the old confession of faith that comes down to the church through the centuries, there is this line that says, "We beseech you to have mercy upon us." If we were even a higher liturgical church, we might actually sing the Kyrie, Kyrie eleison, which is a Greek phrase. It means, Lord have mercy. And we know it is one of the most oldest pieces of liturgy that comes down into the church because it's in Greek. I mean, it managed to transfer the church going to the west and into the language of Latin, and then into the various languages of modern European churches. That it's still in Greek testifies to its importance in the consciousness of the church. So what do we mean by mercy? When we think about mercy, immediately a power differential comes to mind. There is the person who has the power to have mercy, and that person usually stands over and against a person who is an offender or a victim. And the person who has the power to extend mercy has the power to either go with punishment or with some inflicting of harm, or to be able to refrain from it. And so we get this sort of upside downside to what it is to have mercy, that there is a person who is above and a person who is below. Our modern translations, and the one we read is the contemporary English version, often substitute mercy with the word pity. But even if you think about that, the word pity still has the same kind of power differential. I mean, there is the person above who takes pity on the person below who is maybe in worse circumstances than the person who is taking pity. And there is some sort of equation where the person who has more, the person who is experiencing pity, tries to maybe lift up and eliminate that differential between the two. And is this not the way we read the gospel lesson for today? After all, if we go through it, Jesus is going through Jericho, kind of like a rock star. He has a large entourage. His disciples are crowded around him. There's a lot of hubbub and noise. Off to the side of the road is a blind beggar. And he calls for Jesus to have mercy, to have pity. And he is not heard except by those on the fringe of the crowd who tell him, "Be quiet." But he cries all the louder, and that eventually pierces to Jesus, who says, "Call the man over." And again, as we read that, and I've always thought that that is kind of a strange thing to do. I mean, after all, if someone is in a position where they are infirm or unable to do things, dealing with a disability, why should the person with the disability come on over to the person who has power? But the way we read it, it makes sense, because Jesus is the one who has the power, and so the one who is infirm must come and beg for that mercy. Then Jesus gives him what he wants, and then they move on down. And really, this kind of thinking about mercy dovetails very nicely with a theology of sin and punishment that has come down to us throughout the church. And as we, some of us who have grown up even 50 years ago in the church, we have this notion that there is a separation between God and us, and it is our sin that separates us. And there has to be some sort of punishment equation. God has the power to punish us or not to punish us, and when God doesn't punish us, we call that mercy. And really, if you go a level deeper than that, this really sort of presupposes that God is an angry and wrathful person, that God's anger and wrath must find a target. And if you go to the great churches of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in Europe, and you see these sort of pictures of God up on the ceilings and the walls of these churches, it is always an angry, wrathful old man. And then if you go a level deeper than that, what is the cross all about? Well, the cross becomes that place where God's wrath is diverted from us and falls on Jesus, and Jesus then bears all the sins of the world. And again, if you go to Europe and look at those great churches from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you can see in the pictures of the crucifixion, Christ on the cross, a real sense that he is carrying the weight of the world. As a parent, I've always had a great deal of difficulty with that theology. And I'll tell you why. I mean, growing up, Sasha would make an infraction, and I'm not picking on her, all of us parents know that. All of us have had our kids do something that has moved us to anger. And yet not once have I had to divert my anger by punching out the wall or kicking the dog. I've held it within and dealt with it and moved on. And if I can do that as a limited human being, why can't God? Truth is, this whole theology that we have been handed down comes from about 1,000 years ago from Anselm of Canterbury, who lived in a very different time from us. He lived in a time where society was organized around feudal lordship. And what he was trying to do was to make Christianity make sense for the people of his time. And what he said is God is like a great feudal lord. And people would understand that because that's the society they lived in. But what was the most important thing for a feudal lord? Honor. People lived by honor, and if that honor was besmirched, somehow, some way, that had to be restored. And only when that honor was restored could mercy be meted out. And so in Anselm's idea, God is full of honor. Our sin dishonors God. And somehow, in some way, through the cross, that honor is restored so that we can receive mercy. That's what happens when you take a very culturally limited and time-limited metaphor and crystallize it so that it lasts for 1,000 years. And our whole notion of what mercy is in the church today falls from that idea of 1,000 years ago. So, what are we to do with this word, mercy? Fortunately, we have a great gift. It is called the Septuagint. It is a Greek translation of Hebrew Scripture. It was completed about 130 years before Jesus was born. And it's written in the same language as the New Testament was written, the same dialect of Greek. Yeah, it's about 150 years older in terms of Greek, but language did not change as fast back then as our language changes today. And our language changes almost overnight. And so what we can do is we can look at words and phrases in the New Testament. And then we can go to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and see if these same words and phrases occur there in that translation. And if they do, then mine down into the Hebrew to begin to understand how some of the Jewish Israelite Semitic culture that is embedded within the Hebrew Old Testament is transferred within to the New Testament. And it turns out that as we look at the New Testament, the word that we translate as mercy or pity is actually eleo. And again, it's the same word that I mentioned before, in Christe eleison, Christ have mercy. And if we go back into Hebrew scripture, we find a number of instances where this very same formula in Mark occurs. And when we go into the Hebrew, we find that the word there is rechem. And that is a plural form of a very interesting word. The singular translates as womb. The place of life. The place where life begins. Where life is nurtured and protected. And we begin to see in this word, as it enters the plural and begins to sort of embrace sort of the metaphor of what it is to be womb-like, what it is to be mother. We begin to understand that this is a word that encompasses embrace. That it encompasses the feelings of a mother for her children in terms of protection and nurture and wanting the best for them. It encompasses the feeling of a mother who becomes fierce when her children are threatened. Of a mother turned sorrowful and crying when her children fall into misfortune. And so far from being a word that we understand as mercy, that has a power differential between the one in power and the one who is powerless, we find that the biblical concept is one more of embracing and giving life. One that's much more of a gut feeling when you see something wrong. And really the kind of best word that describes that in English is compassion, which derives from the Latin word to suffer along with. When was the last time you really were twisted in your gut when you saw something wrong? I can remember the first time that I felt that as an adult. I was in college, and my college roommate and I lived kitty corner from the Catholic campus ministry run by Jesuits. And as someone who really grew up in a very strongly, almost exclusively Protestant context, it was an eye-opening thing to go to Mass with my roommate and to encounter Jesuits. It was just phenomenal. One time we were coming home. We'd be going there every Saturday night for Mass, and then we'd go to my church together on Sunday morning. And one night, there was a fellow who followed us home. And as we were climbing the stairs to go into our house, he kind of stayed there on the sidewalk looking at us like a lost puppy. We invited him in and had dinner with him. And as we were sharing a meal with him, his story began unfolding about how he really wanted to go into the priesthood and achieve holy orders. And as we were talking to him and listening to him and watching him, it really was very obvious that he had all the gifts and graces for ministry. He was an incredible person. Then he dropped the bombshell that he had just heard from the diocese that he was utterly rejected from pursuing holy orders because he was gay. And it was at that point in the meal that I got that gut-wrenching punch that almost took the wind out of me. And I have never been able to look at gender issues from a detached viewpoint ever since, because my gut told me something was wrong. This is the kind of compassion, mercy that the Bible is talking about. Not this higher status with a lower unfortunate person, but the kind of gut-wrenching realization that you have just encountered something that is profoundly out of kilter. And can we maybe go back into the New Testament and verify that? Because just to go back to our own story is just to create a circular argument, and it turns out we can. Even in the Gospel of Mark, I want to take you back to the very first chapter. After Jesus is baptized, Mark begins a whirlwind description of the first days of ministry of Jesus. He goes to Capernaum, he goes to the synagogue, deals with a demented person, everybody goes, wow. After services, he goes over to Peter's house to have dinner, but Peter's mother-in-law is sick. He lifts her up by the hand, she becomes the first deacon, starts serving them, and everybody goes, wow. And then by the time the sun sets, because it is Sabbath, the whole town has heard about what Jesus has done, and all the sick and the demented come, and everybody goes, wow. And Jesus then escapes during the night, because the crowds are pressing him. And they pursue him. Actually, the word that Mark uses is hunt, as in chasing after a wild animal with a pack of hounds to find him and bring him back to Capernaum so they could install him as the town shaman. And they finally find him, and Jesus resists. He goes on the road to teach and to proclaim the kingdom, and on the way he meets a leper. And the text gets very interesting at this point. When the leper says, "Can you help me?" The NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, says, and this is a ridiculous translation. It says, Jesus took pity on him. Actually, the Greek is far more graphic. It says Jesus' entrails were utterly stirred up. In other words, he felt that punch in the gut, that churning inside that doubled him over as he reached out his hand to heal. And if this is a correct understanding of how we should look at this word that we see translated as mercy or pity, then let's go back to this story that we read at the very beginning. Jesus is going through Jericho, and he's kind of like a rock star. People all around him, clamoring around him, wanting to hang on every word. And off to the side of the road there is a blind man who says, "Jesus, have compassion on me." And know that when we use this word, he is calling for Jesus to recognize in his gut what his situation is. But he cannot hear it. And so he screams louder. And Jesus hears. And Jesus' guts are churned. And maybe he even doubles over in pain. And maybe this is the explanation for why Jesus calls the blind man over to him, because he cannot move. He feels the pain so intensely. And in the midst of this great throng, there is this wonderful, intimate conversation that begins to take place. What do you want? To see. And Jesus heals him. And that man becomes a disciple. If you read the Greek, follows Jesus from that day on. It's the same language as that of calling the original 12 disciples. And together they walk into a new kind of future. And if this reading of the story is right, then that raises, I think, profound questions for how we relate to people and how we engage in mission. It is so easy for us, when we see the suffering of others, to remain aloof. In fact, our society tells us that's the better way. If you can remain detached and objective as a professional, maybe you can see a pathway through that the person suffering cannot. And so we retain this sort of power differential. The one who has the power to help, the one who has the power to see, over and against the one who is suffering. But I think our texts are telling us no. What we are called to do, especially in pastoral care, is to enter into that pain, to enter into the situation, to embrace, to make that person's pain our own pain, and in embrace and in arms locked together, we try to find a way forward. That even though we walk through the middle of the valley of the shadow, and for some people that is very real, in pastoral care we enter that valley too. and we find a way to sit at God's gracious and hospitable and abundant table and celebrate life. And so who around our congregation are people whom we need to embrace? Certainly Jeremiah Williams, certainly Elmer Ragland, certainly Sam Perkins, others who find themselves once more walking that dreadful journey of cancer again. How can we be different? Show true mercy, true pity, true compassion in our journey together. And when we look at mission, it is so easy for us to be on the upside, dispensing food at the food pantry, dispensing food at Martha's Kitchen, dispensing gift cards to students at back. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do those things. They're very important. But maybe how we do them is the issue. Can we find a way to enter their frustration, to enter their alienation, to enter their humiliation for where they are and where they find themselves in life, and step down out of that power differential and lock hands and embrace them and walk with them in partnership to find a new way to live. And if all that is true, then I think when you look at these passages in Mark and in the other synoptic gospels where Jesus says, "You must take up your cross and follow me," that is not a saying that is talking about us crucifying ourselves and crucifying our own shortcomings and crucifying our own sins so that we can deal with them and get rid of them. No, I think it is to pick up a cross that is to live the life of compassion. That is to enter deeply into the lives and the pains and the broken dreams of others. And to cry with them. But at the same time, link arms and walk forward and begin to learn to sing the songs of Easter, the songs of resurrection, the songs of life. Because ultimately, that is who we are as an Easter people. People who go down into the grave, yet expecting resurrection and new life. This is the path that our God invites us to travel.